There are roughly 20 supervolcanoes scattered across the planet, and on any given day, most of them sit quietly, doing essentially nothing newsworthy. But right now, several of them are doing something else, something that's kept volcanologists watching considerably more closely than usual. Ground is rising by measurable centimeters. Earthquake counts are climbing into the tens of thousands. In at least one case, a national government has set aside hundreds of millions of dollars specifically to prepare the population living on top of it. None of this means an eruption is imminent, and I want to be upfront about that before going any further, because the honest science here is considerably more nuanced than supervolcano wakes up. But it also doesn't mean nothing is happening. This is what scientists are actually watching right now, why they're watching it, and what the real current risk assessment looks like for each of the specific systems drawing the most attention. Before getting into specific locations, it's worth being precise about the term itself, since it gets used pretty loosely in casual conversation and headline writing. A supervolcano isn't an official geological classification with a single universally agreed definition. It's a descriptive label applied to volcanic systems capable of producing what's called a supereruption. An eruption ejecting more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of material, categorized as a magnitude 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the top of a scale that runs from 0 to 8. For comparison, that's roughly 1,000 times larger than the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. An event that was itself devastating on a regional scale. Supervolcanoes generally form in one of two geological settings. Over a stationary mantle hotspot, where a persistent plume of unusually hot material rises from deep within the Earth's mantle and slowly burns through the crust above it as tectonic plates drift over the hotspot's fixed location, which is the mechanism behind Yellowstone, or at subduction zones, where one tectonic plate is forced beneath another, generating the kind of large, complex magma systems responsible for calderas like Campi Flegrei in Italy. In both cases, what makes these systems genuinely different from an ordinary cone-shaped volcano isn't necessarily how frequently they erupt. Most supervolcanoes sit dormant for tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years between major eruptions. It's the sheer scale of magma storage capacity sitting beneath them when they eventually do. USGS geophysicist Michael Poland, scientist in charge at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, has specifically pushed back on how the supervolcano label tends to get interpreted by the public, noting that people often immediately assume it implies an imminent, civilization-ending eruption, when the actual scientific reality is considerably more nuanced and depends heavily on understanding each individual system's own specific long-term behavioral pattern, rather than treating every supervolcano as functionally identical. If there's a single system currently drawing the most sustained scientific attention, it's Campi Flegrei, a roughly 12 by 15 kilometer caldera sitting just west of Naples, Italy, directly beneath and around a densely populated urban area, home to an estimated 500,000 people living within what's officially designated the highest risk red zone. Campi Flegrei has been in a documented ongoing state of volcanic unrest since 2005, following an earlier, shorter episode of unrest in the early 1980s that also produced significant ground deformation and seismicity before eventually subsiding without an eruption. The current, considerably longer unrest episode has produced sustained ground uplift, with the caldera floor having risen well over a meter cumulatively since the unrest began, alongside a substantial and, in recent years, accelerating pattern of seismic activity. Seismic monitoring conducted by Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology recorded a dramatic increase in earthquake activity between January 2022 and March 2025, with researchers using an enhanced machine learning-assisted monitoring approach, identifying more than 54,000 individual seismic events during that window, up from roughly 12,000 detected using earlier analysis methods, a jump that reflects both genuinely increased underlying activity and improved detection sensitivity working together. That seismicity hasn't just continued, it's specifically intensified further into 2026. Recent monitoring has documented earthquake swarms numbering in the dozens to low hundreds within single-week windows, concentrated particularly beneath the towns of Pozzuoli and the Agnano area, alongside a magnitude 4. 4 earthquake in May 2026, among the more significant individual seismic events recorded during this entire unrest episode. Ground uplift has continued at a documented pace of roughly 10 millimeters per month in recent monitoring periods, a rate that, sustained over time, adds up to genuinely substantial cumulative deformation. Given the scale of this ongoing activity and the sheer number of people living directly within the highest risk zone, the Italian government has allocated approximately 500 million euros specifically towards safety measures, building reinforcement, and evacuation infrastructure planning for the surrounding population. A concrete, practical illustration of just how seriously regional authorities are treating this specific situation, independent of whether an actual eruption ultimately occurs. Two significant research efforts published in 2023 and 2025 have specifically worked to clarify what's actually driving this pattern of unrest, and the resulting picture is genuinely more complex, and in some respects more reassuring, than a simple story of magma steadily rising toward the surface. The 2023 research focused specifically on carbon dioxide emissions at the Solfatara Picciarelli zone within the Caldera, since volcanic CO2 output often increases as magma rises and begins releasing dissolved gas, a process that can precede an eruption. Beyond Campi Flegrei, Yellowstone, and Long Valley, several other supervolcanic systems around the world currently draw regular scientific monitoring attention, each for somewhat different reasons. Toba in Sumatra, Indonesia, is tied with Yellowstone as one of the most powerful supervolcanoes on the planet in terms of historical eruption scale, responsible for what's widely considered the largest volcanic eruption of at least the past 2 million years, an event some researchers have linked to a significant, if still debated, impact on global climate and even early human population dynamics at the time. The Taupō volcanic zone in New Zealand and the Aira caldera in Japan, the latter associated with the still-active Sakurajima volcano, are both generally assessed among the systems statistically most likely to produce another eruption on a relatively nearer-term timescale, reflecting patterns of more frequent historical activity compared to some of the other systems discussed here. And more remote systems, including Laguna del Maule in Chile and Uturuncu in Bolivia, both located within South America's volcanically active Andean region, have also shown documented patterns of ground deformation and subsurface activity that keep them on the working list of systems volcanologists continue tracking closely, even though public attention rarely reaches them the way it has Campi Flegrei or Yellowstone. Sean de Silva, a volcanologist at Oregon State University who specializes in these large caldera systems, has described the current state shared by several of these systems, Campi Flegrei, Yellowstone, Long Valley, and Toba among them, using a memorable framing. All of them currently sit in what he terms a resurgent stage, a long-term post-eruption phase where ground deformation and earthquake swarms represent essentially normal, expected background behavior for a system still settling after its last major eruptive episode, however many tens of thousands of years ago that episode actually occurred, rather than each individual signal necessarily indicating fresh movement toward a new eruption. It's worth being honest about why volcanologists studying these systems remain reluctant to issue confident, specific eruption predictions, even amid genuinely elevated activity at sites like Campi Flegrei, because the underlying science is difficult in some specific, well-understood ways. Calderas like these don't behave like the more familiar cone-shaped stratovolcanoes most people picture when they think of a volcanic eruption, where magma rising through a single central conduit produces a fairly predictable sequence of escalating warning signs. Supervolcanic systems are considerably more complex, involving broad, distributed zones of ground deformation, multiple interacting subsurface reservoirs of magma and hydrothermal fluid, and, as the recent Campi Flegrei research specifically demonstrated, genuine ambiguity over whether a given observed signal, rising CO2, an earthquake swarm, ground uplift, reflects magma itself moving, or a separate, though still hazardous, hydrothermal process, operating largely independently of any actual eruption becoming more likely. Distinguishing between those different underlying mechanisms in real time, using the specific pattern of seismic, geochemical, and ground deformation data available at any given moment, is precisely the ongoing scientific challenge driving the kind of detailed technical research described throughout this video. That difficulty is exactly why the monitoring infrastructure at these sites keeps getting more sophisticated, rather than settling into a fixed, unchanging baseline. Machine learning-enhanced seismic analysis at Campi Flegrei nearly quintupled the number of detectable earthquakes researchers could actually catalog and study. Distributed acoustic sensing at Long Valley is providing a fundamentally denser picture of underground activity than conventional seismometer networks alone could deliver. Each of these technical advances is specifically aimed at closing the same underlying gap, giving volcanologists a clearer, more confident basis for distinguishing ordinary resurgent stage background activity from a genuine, meaningful shift toward eruption, precisely because that distinction remains, even with all of today's improved monitoring technology, a genuinely difficult one to make with full confidence. It's worth understanding the actual toolkit involved in monitoring a caldera this size, since the technology itself has become a genuinely important part of this story, not just a background detail. Ground deformation, whether a caldera floor is rising or subsiding, is tracked using a combination of GPS stations permanently installed across the region and satellite-based radar interferometry, a technique that compares radar images of the same ground surface taken at different times to detect even extremely small changes in elevation, often down to the millimeter level across a wide area. That kind of satellite coverage is particularly valuable for a caldera like Campi Flegrei, since it allows researchers to track deformation continuously across the entire affected region, rather than relying solely on scattered individual GPS stations. And it's precisely this kind of layered monitoring that's allowed scientists to document the sustained pattern of ground rising that's defined the current unrest episode since 2005. Seismic monitoring networks, meanwhile, track the frequency, location, depth, and magnitude of earthquakes across a region. And increasingly, researchers are turning to machine learning, specifically to improve how much useful signal they can actually extract from that raw seismic data. The retrained machine learning workflow applied to Campi Flegrei's seismic catalog is a direct example of this shift, allowing researchers to detect and properly catalog a considerably larger number of smaller, previously overlooked earthquakes than earlier. More conventional detection methods could reliably identify, expanding the usable dataset dramatically without requiring a single new physical sensor to be installed. Combined with direct geochemical sampling of volcanic gases, tracking exactly how much carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases are being released at specific vent sites, and geophysical imaging techniques capable of mapping subsurface fluid-filled structures at depth, this combination of tools gives volcanologists a genuinely multi-layered picture of what's happening beneath a given caldera, even though, as the Campi Flegrei research specifically illustrates, correctly interpreting what that combined picture actually means remains a considerably harder problem than simply collecting the data in the first place. It's worth grounding all of this monitoring effort in a sense of what's actually at stake, since the reason volcanologists invest this much effort into understanding these systems traces directly back to what past supereruptions have actually done, both to the immediate surrounding region and, in the largest cases, to the entire planet. The Toba eruption in Sumatra, generally dated to roughly 74,000 years ago, ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, among the largest known volcanic eruptions in the past several million years, and some researchers have proposed it triggered a period of significant global cooling in the years immediately following, sometimes described as a volcanic winter, severe enough that some scientists have specifically linked it to a documented genetic bottleneck in early human populations around that same period, though that specific causal link remains genuinely debated within the broader research community rather than settled fact. Yellowstone's own past supereruptions, the most recent occurring roughly 640,000 years ago, are estimated to have blanketed large portions of what's now the central United States in volcanic ash, with effects on regional and potentially global climate that researchers continue actively studying using evidence preserved in ice cores and geological deposits from that period. Campi Flegrei's own largest documented eruption, occurring roughly 39,000 years ago and known to researchers as the Campanian ignimbrite eruption, is estimated to have ejected somewhere in the range of several hundred cubic kilometers of material, and has similarly been proposed by some researchers as a contributing factor in significant climate disruption across Europe during that period, coinciding with a time when both Neanderthal and early modern human populations were present across the affected region. None of these ancient events tell researchers precisely when or whether any of these systems will erupt again on a similar scale, but they do provide the underlying reason this level of sustained monitoring investment, machine learning enhanced seismic networks, satellite radar deformation tracking, direct gas sampling, continues to be treated as a serious scientific and public safety priority, rather than an excessive response to systems that are, after all, statistically unlikely to produce another supereruption within any given individual year. Pulling this all together, the honest current scientific position on supervolcanoes isn't several of them are about to erupt. It's closer to this. A handful of major systems, Campi Flegrei most prominently, are currently showing genuinely elevated levels of measurable unrest, elevated enough to justify serious, sustained monitoring investment and, in Italy's case, direct government spending on population safety infrastructure, while the actual probability of an imminent large-scale eruption at any of these specific sites remains low based on everything researchers currently understand about how these systems typically behave during a resurgent phase. That's not a reason to dismiss the story, and it's not a reason to panic over it either. It's a reason to appreciate why volcanologists like Poland and De Silva keep emphasizing the importance of understanding each individual system's own specific behavioral history and personality, rather than defaulting to the blunt, headline-friendly framing of supervolcanoes simply waking up. Campi Flegrei's current unrest is real, sustained, and taken seriously enough to warrant hundreds of millions of euros in direct government safety spending. Yellowstone remains enormous and geologically active, but comparatively calm right now. Long Valley is being watched with genuinely new monitoring technology, specifically because researchers want a better answer than they currently have. And a handful of less publicly familiar systems, from Toba to Uturuncu, remain part of the same ongoing global effort to actually understand what these enormous, ancient, and still very much active systems are doing beneath our feet, whether or not any of them are anywhere close to doing something dramatic anytime soon. If there's a single honest takeaway to carry forward from all of this, It's that Scientists Are Watching is doing a lot of quiet, unglamorous work in that title, and it deserves to be taken at face value, rather than read as code for an imminent catastrophe. Watching, in the actual practice of modern volcanology, means installing denser sensor networks, refining machine learning models to catch smaller earthquakes than were previously detectable, running laboratory experiments to distinguish magma movement from hydrothermal pressure, and slowly, patiently building a clearer picture of what normal actually looks like for each individual system, so that if and when something genuinely abnormal does eventually happen, there's a real chance of recognizing it early enough for it to actually matter. That's a considerably less dramatic story than the one implied by most supervolcano headlines, but it's the true one, and it's arguably a more reassuring one too.